Yes. We are now in session 6, and we'll be talking about legacies of colonialism. I will be the moderator for this session, and we will have a keynote address by Dr. Akasemi Newsome, and I will introduce her, and then she will present, and then I'll introduce the rest of our presenters who are doing a group presentation. So Dr. Akasemi Newsome is Associate Director of the Institute of European Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Newsome has a decade of experience in corporate communications, policy, philanthropy, research, and teaching at businesses and organizations such as Dutch Telecom, the German Marshall Fund of the US, the Russell Sage Foundation, AFSCME, FAOS at the University of Copenhagen, Denmark, and the Social Science Research Center of Berlin. She speaks German and has lived and worked in Germany for a number of years. Her research on the politics of labor, immigration, and comparative racialization addresses topics at the forefront of international and comparative political economy, including rights and global governance, institutions, capitalist development, and social movements. In addition to 2 co-edited special issues and published articles in the Journal of European Integration, Comparative Labor Law and Policy Journal, Perspectives on Europe and PS, Political Science and Politics, her book manuscript, The Color of Solidarity, examines the conditions for labor union support of immigrant claims making in Europe. So I will turn it over to her and she will begin her presentation. And I will go ahead and share screen.
I will be using any slides.
Okay, yes, I don't see it in here, so yes. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jalyn, for that warm and generous introduction. Thank you to all the student conference organizers, Kellen Robinson, Tracy Ridley Jr., Jalyn, of course, and Cameron Lofton for inviting me and for this honor. And of course, thank you to Sarah Hutchinson for all the work supporting you in this conference. As stated, my name is Akasemi Newsome, and I lead the Institute of European Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And my topic today is colonialism and its legacies in the study of Europe, or more aptly, the elephant in the room of European politics. And I want to underscore that I will approach this topic from a specific positionality and biography. I'm an African-American woman in a pretty privileged position with 3 degrees. I've been engaged in European politics for just over 20 years, counting my undergraduate honors thesis that I wrote at Columbia University in 2000 through to the TAM program from 2003 to 2004, beginning my PhD in political science at Berkeley in 2007 through 2015, and then leading the Institute since 2015 until today. I came to the study of politics in Europe because my first job in Germany was one where, as an intern at Deutsche Telekom, parent company to T-Mobile, in Bonn, I was paid. I received free housing, healthcare, and dental care, 6 weeks of vacation, as well as a monthly discounted train ticket. And I wanted to understand why I was having such a different experience from my friends in New York, who after graduating college had unpaid internships and no benefits. But at the same time, something that really piqued my curiosity was whether the material experience that I was having was something that was shared by people of color who grown up in Germany. Is this experience that I'm having one that Turkish people or people of color in general share? And the short answer is no, that they did not. But why? I move ahead from that first internship, when I came to TAM, my favorite class was the one on the welfare state by John Stevens. I wonder if he still offers that. Perhaps some of you are even enrolled in it right now. This course was such a fascinating intellectual experience because it gave me a new way of thinking about poverty and social policy, because you had the organization of North America and Western Europe into social policy spheres. Scandinavia, particularly Sweden, emerged as a utopia. I sat in class through a number of sessions and I wondered when we would talk about race, when we would talk about immigration. And we did. Race was an American problem owing to its unique history of slavery. For this reason, social democracy never got a foothold. We never got around to things like universal healthcare and free college. In it, the framing was inescapable, that diversity was the problem. Furthermore, recent immigration to Europe posed the main challenge to these utopian societies of Scandinavia and Western Europe more broadly. These are homogenous societies, so the takeaway message went from several articles and scholarly books. They were not used to new immigration. And I accepted this as a TAM student. Immigration was a post-World War II phenomenon. I wanted to do well, and I did work that very much fit within that line of approach. And to fast forward to my first political economy course at Berkeley, where I was pursuing a PhD. This was a course where the post-war social policy models, the welfare state worlds that I'd been introduced to in John Stevens' class, were contextualized much further and anchored in the historical evolution of capitalism. I remember, for example, we read Marx, we read Locke, we read Adam Smith. And it was while reading Marx that we came across passages that mentioned slavery. And given that Capital was published in 1867, I wrote a think piece about the enslavement of Africans by Europeans that had been going on at that time and how that was integral to Marx's development of his concepts. My professor's response was that I was mistaken. Slavery was a metaphor that had nothing whatsoever to do with African enslavement. There's been a problem that I've faced in political science, namely that things that I think are important are not studied in the mainstream of political science, namely colonialism and slavery. I want to stress that for those of you who are German speakers, this is not a Besserwisser tale. It's not one of me knowing better than everyone else in the discipline. It's not one of triumph. This realization is actually more of a kind of horrifying unfolding in which I came to a realization over these years that the staggering and foundational processes of colonialism and slavery, without which Europe would not be, are simply not discussed, dismissed, or at best sidelined as irrelevant for any outcome that is meaningful to the discipline of political science. There's a lot at stake in understanding how central the processes of colonialism and slavery are to European politics. And at base, it's namely about the safety of people of color today, of racialized people in Europe today, and their ability to survive. If we refuse to see them in our disciplines, in our halls of learning, there's no way to make sense of a party like the AfD, like other far-right parties, like the National Front, and their appearance, their appeal, and their resonance, the ways in which their discourse has become attractive to wide swaths of the citizens and resident populations in Western Europe. And the problem of this space that has been cleared out for it, particularly in Germany, by the state. And the danger, again, I want to underscore that these parties and these ideologies around white supremacy pose to people of color, and through them to democracy and to the rule of law. Now, what does this deafening silence sound like? In political science, much of it has to do with the very framing of development. In political economy, it's not uncommon at all to explore how it is that the UK has come onto the world stage as an early developer that industrialized first, and that Germany is a late developer, and that East Asian nations are still later developers, that this discussion theoretically and empirically can happen, that syllabi can be put together without a discussion of development in its deep entanglement with colonialism. Development is understood as though it was wholly separate from colonialism and is at best incidental to development in Western Europe, although central to development in countries in Africa. In many classrooms, in many syllabi, when it comes to European politics, colonialism is just not mentioned, engaged, or discussed. I look back at my training as a political scientist and remark belatedly that I never read anything by writers from the global South contemporaneous with any of the theorists of capitalism. I never read anything by any of the theorists and participants in global South independence movements. I never read anything by political actors that directly addressed the ideology of white supremacy as structural to and totalizing in European politics, in comparative politics, and indeed in the ordering of the world system as we confront it today. The framing, to return to development, the framing of development is simply closed within nations. It's linked to national capacities, as opposed to, again, the very unique and symbiotic extractive and exploitative relationship that Europe and white-dominated settler societies have had with the rest of the world. Now, there is some new work that has begun to scratch at the surface of what needs to be done. I will read a quote from sociologist Gurminda Bhambra's article that was published in 2021, in which she discusses the entanglement of the British economy and welfare state with that of its former colony, India. Open quote, Utsa Patnaik, drawing on 2 centuries of data on tax and trade, calculated that Britain drained a total of around 45 trillion US dollars from India during the period from the Battle of Plassey in 1757 to the outbreak of World War II. While Piketty acknowledges that 2 centuries of colonial rule disrupted the previous developmental logic of India, nowhere is there any mention of what colonization, specifically wealth extracted from colonial processes, did to the developmental logic of Britain. That is, there's no discussion about how India's relative poverty today is intimately connected to and more strongly consequent of the very same colonial processes that made Britain wealthy, end quote. On another topic related to the teaching and training of future political economists and political scientists, there's the figure of Robinson Crusoe and the Robinson Crusoe economy. There's this idea of the rational, maximizing economic individual who conceptually underpins standard economic textbooks and several theoretical approaches in political economy. Matthew Watson has an article with very critical perspective on how the figure of Robinson Crusoe came to be. Start quote. The original novel was written as an imperial fantasy, and in Defoe's hands, Crusoe's economic individualism is indivisible from his status, first as a colonial settler, and then as a colonial master. The Crusoe and Friday signifiers are now so culturally familiar as symbols of a priori imperial age that the recognition of how unreflexively they continue to be used in economics textbooks today still carries something of a shock, end quote. So in this, I like to see Matthew Watson as also, similar to me, awakening to this lack of critical engagement, to this deafening silence on colonialism, not only in European political economy, but in just broader field of economics as well. Another quote from new work that is more critical, that examines the role of race in international relations being a subdiscipline of political science. Kelly Bogley-Svobogo writes in Foreign Policy magazine, start quote, Paul Samuel Reinsch, a founder of modern IR and foreign policy, christened the 20th century as the age of international imperialism. He concluded that states endeavor to increase their resources through the absorption or exploitation of undeveloped regions and inferior races, end quote. Another excerpt, beginning quote. The Journal of Race Development, the first academic IR journal established in 1910, advanced racist treatises, including on the inability of, quote, native races, end quote, to develop states without colonialism. Nonetheless, the journal's pages also included sharp critiques from W.E. Du Bois and other scholars who were critical of European mercantilism. In 1919, this journal was rebranded as the Journal of International Relations without substantive changes. And in 1922, its successor, Foreign Affairs, was born. Now, I've given some examples of new work, recent work that is much more critical about acknowledging the silences of colonialism today in political science and the historical legacies within the academic scholarship when it comes to European politics. Now I would like to think about out loud, why do we have this problem? To turn to my own biography, when I was a high school student, I was in a very diverse environment where there are large percentages of African Americans, Latino students, Asian Americans, and white students. We were all committed to enhancing and advancing diversity in our society and living integrated multiracial democracy. This was something I experienced and saw as well among my fellow students of different races. However, as I've proceeded through my professional career, I've had the unfortunate experience that it's become wider and wider and wider. And for example, during my PhD program, there were 3 years when not a single Black student came to participate in the program. So there's this problem of diversity in terms of who is able to become an expert in the field of European politics, in political science more broadly, but in academia more generally. Another issue that I've noticed, again, in my personal biography, is that as I advance professionally and as my fellow colleagues as a group become less diverse, that there is intense pressure to assimilate into the fact that less diversity is equated with higher status and higher quality. That's something personally I found to be distressing and disturbing. But unfortunately, many of my colleagues, many of my white colleagues, at best are complacent and at worst embrace these signifiers of status and quality, that it must be good the fewer people of color are around and have achieved that status. When it comes to looking outside of higher education, some of the statistics are quite daunting. In, for example, the UK, we are looking at 1% of total faculty that are Black. When we are looking at the US faculty more generally, we are looking at around 5% of faculty that are African American, and over 90% of these are in HBCUs. When you look at think tanks, when you look at the Foreign Service, there too we see statistics in which it is very difficult for African Americans specifically, but people of color more broadly, to make inroads. I can post links to studies detailing this in the chat. As I said at the beginning of this talk, colonialism and slavery are elephants in the room in European politics, in comparative politics, and in political science more broadly, in the training, in the curriculum, in what you learn, and who can teach it. Knowledge about politics directly influences how students understand the world. The silences on colonialism risk a woefully inadequate understanding, in fact, renders incoherent global inequality and obscures the dangers faced by people of color in Europe by the rise of the far right. Now, what is to be done? I can say that I'm very inspired by this conference, and especially its participants and you, the organizers. Many of you will go into foreign affairs. You will go into European studies think tanks. You will go into academia. You will become policy specialists. You will go into industry. As a single individual, it is impossible to overturn these ways of thinking. But together, working together, you can do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Newsome, for your presentation. You brought up a lot of great points and pertinent questions as it relates to colonialism and European studies. It was really nice listening to you and your expertise, and I hope we all take something away from your presentation. I know I definitely will. I would definitely love it if you could share the links to the studies that you mentioned also. And for people who have questions or anything, I think we will save the questions and discussions for the end. So we have one more presentation in this session for Legacies of Colonialism. And it will be presented by 3 people, actually: Siobhan Cuffe, Neil Doughty, and Mia Spisman. Is that how you say it? Okay, cool. So I will read their biographies and then I will turn it over to them and they will present. So Siobhan Cuffe is currently pursuing her MA through the Transatlantic Master's Program, studying at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Humboldt University in Berlin. Her research interests include asylum and integration policy, particularly intersectional discrimination and its effects on migration policy and migrants themselves. Siobhan will present alongside Neil and Mia, like I mentioned. And now I'll introduce Neil. Neil was born and raised in Houston, Texas. Neil studied German economics and psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. After graduating in 2017, he lived in Germany for nearly 4 years before starting the TAM program this past fall. His research interests include transnational social movements and environmental policy transfer. He will complete his second year of studies in Berlin. And for Mia Spisman, she is currently attending the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill's Transatlantic Master's Program on the German-Turkish Studies track. Her areas of interest are identity politics and immigration. She is originally from Northern California and is spending the next semester at the Middle Eastern Technical University in Ankara, Turkey. So the presentation between these three will address the lack of colonial history in European studies. They will present a brief history of Eurafrica to dispel the post-colonial myth of European integration, discuss EU historiography and the importance of teaching colonial history, and propose a path forward for future European study curricula. So I will turn it over to them for their presentations. And I believe one of you will be sharing the screen, or do you want me to?
Okay, hello, welcome to our presentation. Today we are here to discuss how colonialism is taught, or rather not taught in European studies curricula, and how that does a disservice to students. And before I continue, I'd just like to say that we are so honored to be following Dr. Newsome, and we loved your presentation. All right, I'd like to go over a brief roadmap for this presentation. Neil? Okay, the first section of this presentation will be handled by my colleague Siobhan, who will use the example of Eurafrica to illustrate the gap in instruction in relation to European studies. This is just one of many examples, but we found this one particularly illustrates the gap between what is taught and relevant knowledge. Then my colleague Neil will expand on that gap and explain the disservice it does to students in the subject. I will then finish up by discussing how to close that gap and offering some recommendations. That being said, I would like to pass it off to Siobhan.
Great, thank you, Mia. So let's start with the myth that the EU is post-colonial. So the EU is often taught and analyzed as a post-colonial institution. Its immediate forebearer, the EEC, is considered the embodiment of Europe's new focus on interdependence and the end of colonial aspirations after World War II. In fact, European integration specialists like Andrew Moravchik, who we have studied in the TAM curriculum, claimed that colonial aspirations could not explain the founding of the EEC and asserted that colonial considerations declined quickly in the 50s and 60s. This is far from reality. The motives behind early European integration were far from post-colonial. The planners of early European integration were quite aware that they needed their colonial territories to achieve economic prosperity. The continent had been ravaged by World War II, and Europe did not hold the resources needed to rebuild. European powers needed to extract resources from their colonial possessions in order to restore Europe. It was widely acknowledged, as you can see in the highlighted parts of this quote, by the architects of the Treaty of Rome, which was the founding document of the EEC, that resources taken from African territories would be the very foundation of the European economy. Additionally, they knew that European control over African territories could allow them to access these resources cheaply and easily. And the economic structure, which stripped and transported wealth from Africa to Europe without fair or reciprocal prosperity, was well planned and purposefully executed. Early European integration was deeply enmeshed with colonialism in Africa, and it's most obvious through the concept of Eurafrica. And I'll give a short summary of how the EEC and Eurafrica came to be at the same time. So European powers had long been in competition to gain colonial territories and expand their empires. They knew that colonial aspirations had caused ample conflict in the past, and they were highly motivated to avoid armed conflict between European powers in the wake of World War II. So Europe needed a way to profit from these territories without inciting conflict, and the EEC was created with this goal in mind. In 1957, the Treaty of Rome created the European Economic Community and its key attribute, the common market. The founding states of the EEC agreed to allow the free movement of goods, people, services, and capital between states. But most importantly, the Treaty of Rome includes in Article 3 that the activity of the community shall include the association of the overseas territories and countries in order to increase trade and promote jointly economic and social development. Namely, that the single market would include colonial territories of the EEC member states, largely France and Belgium. So the first image that you can see is a map showing administrative divisions on the continent of Africa as of 1957. All of the area that is outlined in red and hashed out in yellow are included in the common market created by the Treaty of Rome. In the next picture, you can see that geographical area included in the common market transposed onto a modern map. As you can see, the vast majority of the geographical area included in the common market actually lies outside of Europe. In fact, 3/4 of the territory included in the Treaty of Rome was made up of colonial territories claimed by the initial 6 member states. This region, the European and African territories combined, was conceptualized as Eurafrica. As time moved on and European powers lost their hold on colonial territories, several conventions would follow the Treaty of Rome. On the next slide, yeah, we can see those. So the first was the Yonde Convention in 1963, and it extended the terms of the Treaty of Rome to apply to 18 newly independent former colonies. Its successor, the Lome Convention in 1975, was an agreement adjusted for the UK's entrance into the EU, and it extended the, quote, special relationship to Commonwealth countries, which had been part of the British Empire. That convention lasted until 1995, when it was found to violate WTO trade agreement guidelines. The Lome Convention was then succeeded by the Cotonou Convention, which includes WTO compliant trade rules. A new trade agreement, which finished negotiations in 2021, has yet to be signed into law. But these agreements carry the long-lasting legacy of the Treaty of Rome and its colonial aspirations. In closing for this section, as is evidenced by the example of Eurafrica, the roots of the European Union are deeply enmeshed with colonialism. While the aims and policies of the EU have changed since the founding of the EEC, it is impossible to fully understand the EU without understanding its pro-colonial beginnings. If we are supposed to be considered experts on the European Union, then this is content that we should be addressing.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, for that. And also thank you, Dr. Newsome, for that incredible keynote speech. So I'm going to be taking the story of Eurafrica and trying to contextualize it within the sort of dominant narrative of EU integration that we've experienced in European studies and that we see in collective EU remembrance. And we chose to start with the story of Eurafrica because it really cuts to the root of one of the most common ways that Europe distances itself from colonialism. And in order to understand this, the author of the piece that we're drawing from, Hansen and Johnson, about Eurafrica, they argue essentially that Eurafrica serves as a vanishing mediator between an old phase of colonial Europe and a new phase of a supposedly post-colonial Europe. And essentially the way that they structure their argument is that early on, Eurafrica was actually, the creation of Eurafrica and the creation of the EEC was partially motivated by a desire to share colonial sovereignty, particularly for the French to share their colonial sovereignty. And so when we talk about the engines of integration being French, and particularly French politicians playing a key role, there's never any discussion of the colonial motivations behind that. And then second, in this phase, the Treaty of Rome successfully Europeanizes colonialism and creates the entity of Eurafrica and the specific set of colonial trade terms with Eurafrica. And then after the colonies gain their independence, the Yonde Convention codifies the exact same Euro-African trade terms into an international trade agreement, the Yonde Convention, which makes it look post-colonial, but actually the terms are very similar. And together, this creates this illusion of discontinuity between the explicitly colonial Europe-Africa relations and the post-colonial Europe that we now celebrate today as the EU. And this illusion of continuity creates this idea that there was a break with the past, and that European integration is somehow the opposite, or at least mutually exclusive, with colonialism. And this myth can be best seen in a narrative that's extremely prominent and pushed by some of the most prominent scholars of Europe, which is essentially the either-or myth, colonialism or integration. And these arguments go that decolonization was a prerequisite for integration, or that colonialism was a hindrance to it, or at least it was irrelevant. And this either-or narrative that we have experienced in our textbooks and also in general European discourse is really dangerous because it distances Europe from a colonial past, and it creates the impression that Europe doesn't have to do the hard work of reckoning with a colonial past or its living legacies today. And instead, it kind of creates an excuse to, quote, forget colonialism. And indeed, that is precisely what we find in efforts at collective remembrance. I'm sorry, this is in the way, but essentially a systematic study of EU efforts at collective remembrance found that they focused almost exclusively on the Holocaust, National Socialism, and Stalinism, which are inarguably critical to understanding Europe, but they are also curiously quiet about the memories of imperialism and colonialism. And one would hope that this forgetfulness wouldn't translate into Euro studies curricula, but it does. And we're doing this presentation today because this was our experience with introductions to Europe. So we had 6 Intro to Europe textbooks and 0 colonial history. And as Dr. Newsome so eloquently explained, the 19th century is explained through industrialization, nationalism, and democratization, and the 20th century through war and integration and market power. And there are no chapters, subchapters, or even mentions of how colonialism might have played a role in the development of Europe. Now, we know, and we really want to stress also that our program did not do this intentionally, and it's also in no way an exception. In fact, it's just our experience, but there is a systematic problem of limited analytical frameworks within Euro studies curricula. There's a narrow Cold War East-West lens, and there are sort of methodological continentalism and statism, which prioritize knowledge that fits into colonial or national containers, leaving out these sort of critical transnational relationships. But as we're all aware, because we're here, biases are not excuses, and beyond just the historical inaccuracy of not teaching colonial history, avoiding colonialism is also really dangerous because many Euro majors, myself and some of my co-presenters included, don't come in with an academic or a personal background that exposes them to colonial history and decolonial thought. And if, as Euro studies curricula so proudly proclaim that Euro majors become tomorrow's leaders, then Euro studies is cultivating a generation of leaders who have not considered colonialism as one of the driving forces shaping our world, and ultimately making our leaders less prepared to avoid the inexcusable mistakes of Europe's colonial past.
Okay, hello again. So this moves us into my section. Now that we've established this gap through Siobhan and Neil, let's talk about how we can best fill it. So on the next slide, there is a quote from Nancy Wadsworth. And one of the main things that I want to take away from this quote is that colonialism in all forms is an ongoing issue. It's not primarily a historical one. It is historical, but not primarily. Therefore, the way we teach European studies needs to incorporate it as an ongoing issue. So that moves me to colonialism in curriculum. So it's important to understand that the current curricula are a product of an accepted canon of literature, and it's often assumed to be neutral. But this is not true. The European studies canon is taught from the point of Eurocentric authors, and that literature that is disseminated is often produced from within Europe. But the reality of a globalized society and political system is that external sources that depict Europe and the EU are critical. There are 6 billion people living outside of the Occident, and rarely does their scholarship or narrative enter our curricula, despite the overwhelming amount of countries that have colonial histories and are still tied to Europe, both economically and culturally. Now, this is not a rejection of the current scholarship that European studies relies on, but rather adding a parallel narrative that focuses on colonialism and its ongoing effects. This allows students to develop critical thinking skills that they can apply moving forward in their studies. Ultimately, we believe this will lead to a better understanding of a modern multicultural Europe. We can see this through multiplicity, the incorporation of multiple viewpoints and authors, as Dr. Newsome talked about. We need authors and scholars from outside the EU and Europe to be contributing to that canon. We also need to be expanding that canon, as I've talked about. So that moves me into our recommendations. So our recommendation is to make or incorporate an already existing course that offers these missing elements. It must be mandatory that all European studies students should have a basic knowledge of colonialism and critical theory skills. Now on this slide, I've also outlined a couple of already existing courses taught at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which is the university that the 3 of us attend, that could potentially fill some of that gap. Professor Aiden's class, The Middle East and the West, challenges prevalent Eurocentric narratives and explains some of the critical contributions that countries in the Middle East made to the formation of Europe. Professor Olson's course, Introduction to Theory and Research in Global Studies, focuses on globalization and critical theory. And these are just a few of the courses that exist within the Chapel Hill curriculum that could be used to fill this gap, because there is very clearly one. All right, that moves me on to potential course subjects. So some of the subjects that need to be taught in these classes are things like Eurocentrism, multiculturalism, and these are just a few of the suggested topics and readings for courses. If anyone's interested, I have actually designed a rough syllabus for a class that would fill this gap. And like my colleague said, and I want to reiterate, Europe and the EU were not formed in a vacuum. If we truly want to be, the future experts of this area, we need to have this background. We need to incorporate this critical element of European development and, European multiculturalisms and economics, all of it. It needs to be taught, because it is only doing us a disservice to have it not being taught. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for listening to us, and again, to Dr. Newsome, because we loved your talk. Thank you.